Hi.
Yay!
Welcome to Two on One, a theological discussion where two of us, the Reverend Stephanie Kendall, who her friends call her Spiff, and myself, the Reverend Arthur Stewart, talk to one person about a pop culture item of their choosing. Joining us today is the Reverend Whitney Waller Cole, currently serving as senior pastor at Creekwood Christian Church in Flower Mound, Texas. Hi, Whitney.
Hello. It's good to be with y'all.
It is good to have you here.
Yeah, it's so good to have you here. Hi, friend.
It is. I will name that. Like I was just like June was a solid month for
June was a solid month.
for lots of our people and the topics that we're talking about. Speak directly to my heart, to my little things happening. Wet Hot being my all-time favorite comedy. It may be my favorite movie of all time as well.
For those of you not in the know, Wet Hot American Summer is a 2001 flop. It did horribly at the box office despite its all-star
$300,000 is what it made.
It has become a cult classic in the last 20 years with 2 sequels produced by Netflix in the last, 3 or 4?
Mm-hmm.
The cast is Amy Poehler, Bradley Cooper, Joe Trujillo. It's weird the people you choose to highlight. Michael Ian Black, Elizabeth Banks. Janine
Garofalo and David Hyde Pierce are the top. The top 2, like Janine Garofalo is number 1 on the call sheet, which for those of you that don't know, number 1 on the call sheet is generally like your biggest name actor. So it goes Janine Garofalo and David Hyde Pierce in a movie that also stars Paul Rudd, Amy Poehler, and Bradley Cooper. Like,
it's wild.
Christopher Maloney is in it, like as Law and Order is. Anyhow, I'm sorry for those who are unaware of it. It is a raunchy comedy. It is an absurd comedy. We're all clergy who know people from our churches. We may watch this at some point, so we're probably going to avoid quotes of really great lines that we may or may not find funny.
Because we like our jobs.
But if you do watch the movie, please note that we're saying right now it's raunchy. But it's also brilliant. Spiff, part of my interruption, but I just wanted to give that introduction so people knew.
That's great. So there are actually, there are 4 things that you can watch. There's 2 movies. One's a documentary on the making of the film, which is called Hurricane of Fun, which
I've never seen that.
So I think the only place you can actually watch it now is on David Wayne's Vimeo.
Okay.
So go ahead. It's brilliant. It's so good. And so this movie was actually like in real life shot in 28 days, and 23 of those days it was pouring rain.
And
so,
it's summer camp.
It's summer camp. It's August
outside.
It's supposed to be August in Maine.
And I watched this with my husband who had never seen it, and he's like, "What summer camp in existence would you wake up wearing sweatpants?" And it's a good question because it was shot in the spring in Maine.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, it was shot in Pennsylvania at a camp at Camp Tawanda his name's going to escape me, but there's a really famous
Hank Azaria,
that's who it is. Sorry, I was like, oh my gosh. Hank Azaria signed his name on the wall, and Amy Poehler calls him and is just like, I'm staring at your name. I think it was Amy, but
it was Janine. I just read that.
Okay. And and so all of those things, it's a place in Pennsylvania. It doesn't really matter. Anyways, this movie is filled with lots of little nuanced pieces of humor as well, where it's like, if you notice, it is raining in the back of some shots and not in others, and the through line and continuity are just kind of all over the place, which actually I think builds into the brilliance of it all. They also talk about in the Hurricane of Fun how they all stayed in a cabin like together. Like, this movie is not what you think of, like big trailers and things like that, even though these stars are amazing. It was all just very familial. And I'm really grateful to actually get this conversation started with the 2 of you who I met at camp.
That's true. That's true.
And so, yeah.
So Whitney, you chose this movie. What is your experience with it? And what's your favorite part of camp?
Such good questions. So Wet Hot American Summer is my favorite movie of all time. And the reason it is my favorite movie of all time is because I actually think that it is the perfect full package that encompasses all that it is to be both camper and counselor at camp. And I watched this movie for the first time when I was 17, and it was my first summer stewarding a camp.
What is stewarding?
That is such a great question. Stewarding is where you are basically like the gopher who has to do all of the horrible tasks that no counselor wants to do at camp, but you would also never trust a camper to do. And so prestigious though when you're 17 years old and want to spend all of your time in Athens, Texas.
That's a really, really, really good definition of stewarding.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought so too. I'm sure there's like some biblical definition, but really that's what we're talking about when we do it.
I wish they would call stewards helpmeets. I don't really.
I'm filing that memorandum right now. Hopefully that will be changed the next time we are able to have camp in person. But so watching that movie at that time, of like being right in between being a camper and then being a counselor, because I loved camp as both, was just very formative because it helped me see like all of the things that probably were the conversations my counselors were having when we all went to bed, and they were like, that Striver kid, that Whitney Waller, man, she's annoying. But also let me know like the conversations I would get to have as a counselor about, you know, the camper who doesn't shower all week. And
who was named Artie.
Oh, I love Artie. And the indoor kids who, you know, they just want their Dungeons and Dragons tournament. They don't need to go play with the stickball team. And so, you know, just all of that in one package, so beautiful and so great. And I've also found, and Spiff and I talked about this when we were talking about me coming on, I feel like this is a barometer of friendship, the way that people respond to and react to this movie. So my freshman year of college, I gathered like 15 people into my dorm room to watch this movie together. And at the end of the movie, half of us had laughed our heads off hysterically, loved it, bonded forever. The other half, we never spoke again. It was the last time that we talked to each other because I showed them this movie.
They essentially threw you from the moving van of their lives. That's
exactly what happened. Secret pizza party. Which I love pizza, my favorite food. I totally would have fallen. I would have.
And then someone just goes, "Have you seen my swimming buddy?"
Yeah. I'm gonna tell Beth you let him drown, Andy.
All right, so.
So Arthur, you just watched it. You've watched it before, though, right?
I've seen it numerous times.
Okay.
It is.
What was your first time?
What's that? My first time?
Talk about your first time.
My first time was actually right after I got fired from a summer camp I was working at in 2005, because I had avoided it because I had a kind of repressive childhood, not oppressive, repressive. So like Wet Hot American Summer, even though I was a senior in high school when it came out, I was like, oh, I can't go see that. But it had been recommended by friends, and there were still blockbusters, I think, at that point, and I saw it and loved it. Just loved it. And probably good that I didn't see it beforehand. So, yeah. But I just rewatched it on Saturday with my husband, who is a Gen Xer. And he had never seen it before, and he provided a few really good thoughts that I'm probably going to share as our conversation goes to it.
And you're even going to give him credit.
Yeah.
Dang.
Well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I watched it my first year of, it came out when I was my freshman year of college, and so it very much was just like, my good friend Evie was just like, you have to watch this, it's hysterical, we're all watching it, and true to form, you know, we all gathered in with our, you know, VHS tapes. That's how we watched it most often, and just watched it on repeat. Like it's one of those movies that I know every word to. I just watched it with another friend of mine. I made him like just watch it. We did a Netflix party sort of a thing. He hadn't seen it, and he's a Gen Xer as well, and he was just like, that I don't know what to make of that. And I was like, if it doesn't sit in your soul, I mean, he liked it, he thought it was funny, but like it's a movie that sits in my soul so deeply. For a lot.
I'm going to argue that young Xers and old millennials are like what do they call them? Zennials or whatever. I would argue that this is a Zennial movie. This is a gap bridger. Other people may like it. but
I agree. I think I was right at the right. So I'm a Zennial. I can name that. Like I'm an old millennial, and that I think it spoke to my peers of we're in that really weird time frame of like, we didn't grow up with computers necessarily, but we adapted to technology really quickly, and so it's weird.
so
But let's moving forward.
um so let me ask, if I can start with my ridiculous theological question. What is the theological point of camp?
I like it.
And I will also note that this was, God, some of the jokes, some of the like Catskills zany. There's that manic. I'm there's that manic Jewish humor of oh, I'm the camp director. How about you? Oh no, I don't work at the camp. I know, I'm the camp director. There's that, and I call that the Jewish sense of humor, and I don't mean that badly, but that's Mel Brooks. That's the slapstick dialogue, lose it if you drop it. That's very defined about it.
Showalter and Wayne both name that like their Jewish history and background like played a part in their writing and
and their experience of Jewish summer camp.
Yeah.
Exactly.
David Ben Gurion, Jessica Azaria,
which is a completely improvised scene. They like told Janine Garofalo that they were going to give her the list of names, and then she just has a blank sheet of paper, and she's supposed to be calling out roll for the camp. And so it's like this beautiful, how am I going to fuse all of these names together and like create who is in this space, right?
It's like Noel Zimmerberg.
I think it's fair to say like it is a Jewish summer camp without any commentary past that. But we all met. Well, actually, Whitney, you and I met tag teaming a evangelical dork in the TCU newspaper. But the three of us became good friends at summer camp that is based in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Athens, Texas, Disciples Crossing.
Yeah.
So what's the point? What does it do theologically?
So I think that theologically, for me, the importance of camp in my own life, and I think that this ties in a little bit to thinking about like the Jewish heritage that Wayne and Showalter are coming from in creating this movie, is the idea that you find a space apart to lean into who you've been invited to be fully, so that as you leave that space, you're able to have a greater grounding and sense of your own identity. And I think that's what camp did for me as a kid. Like that was the place where I was always able to unabashedly be myself. But not only was I unabashedly able to be myself, I got to encounter other people doing the same. And when we had this shared authenticity, that didn't mean that we were the same people, but that we felt like we had a space to call our own and to be fully present to God, fully present to each other. That let us lean into more of a fullness of who we are and whose we are and like who we're called to be in the world. And I think that's part of the grounding force in the movie that makes it, while it is hilarious and raunchy, it's also so endearing because every single type of kid gets their due in this space. And even every single type of adult gets to come into their own in it. And so I think that's the power of a camping experience.
So in the movie, can we talk about it's honestly my favorite line of, excuse me, where could I find I'm going to mess it up, but eventually, the indoor kids. He tries to say it nicer, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Because I will point out, for our purposes, never without his D20.
His 20-sided die.
His 20-sided die. Here, I've got one in case we need random numbers.
The mosquito.
Yes.
I won't do the entire line. It's so good.
The indoor kids they have their spot. It is a holy place. Steph, what else?
I fully agree with what Whitney's saying, and I guess I would just add into that, because I think we'll probably all agree, is that like it's just the community building, right? It allows you, being called to be fully who you are, only happen, well, it doesn't only happen, but it happens most fully when we get to kind of spread our wings and kind of test the grounds and the waters of who we're called to be in a safe space. And camp does that. Camp offers the safety and security of kind of a home environment, let's call it, for those that have safe and secure homes. But to figure out that, yet still be responsible to a community system. And so it has a lot of like family systems theory kind of to it, in as far as like who we are and who we are called to be in community is expanded when we take ourselves outside of our kind of biological or, you know, placed home into this new system and this new community that holds us accountable to ourselves and to each other in a way that is life-giving, or at least it should be at its best. Obviously, you know, there are camp horror stories where camp is at its worst. I think I've only had really great experiences at camp. I grew up, I did not grow up a Christian or going to church camps. So, but I did go to Brownie camp. And
you mean Girl Scouts? I was just really excited about like
a camp for brownies, like just a factory camp. Cool. I mean, I'd be there too, but yes, I went to Girl Scout camp, and then I went sixth grade camp for us. We had a sixth grade camp, and I did sixth grade camp as a camper and a counselor, and then I moved into soccer camp, which was, it is camp, and yet it had a really specific focus, which I found to be wonderful for me, and yet not the kind of camp experiences of a church camp. And then when I went, so I guess I've had all that to say, I've had lots of different church or camp experiences. So side note, my all-time favorite movie for the most part has always been the original Parent Trap with Haley Mills, you know, Camp Inch. And the very first time when I found myself going to church for the first time, and like, I don't know, like 3 weeks in, they were like, we're going to camp. And I was like, let's try it out. And I went, and the camp that my home church owned was where they filmed the original Parent Trap. And y'all, I lost it. I walked on and like saw the Camp Inch plaque, and I just like lost it. And so camp has always been a space of like, I don't know, faithful renewal of like my callings and my who I am and all of that. And it like started like right there for me. And then, which is a very different camp experience than when I went to council at Athens, where I met all you at Disciples Crossing. Still lovely, still beautiful, but there's a responsibility kind of shift that happens when you, even as an adult, are the camper, and then become the counselor to younger folk.
I'm going to toss out I think it's just an affirmation of what both of you just said, but I want to tell a story if I could. I like doing middle school camp because when it goes great, and when it doesn't go great, you get stories. I also have a wonderful story to tell on Atticus Butler, but I won't while we're recording. It's a good story about it, but anyways, the talent show. Are you gonna do anything? The talent show one night at middle school camp, this kid decided, Brian was like, there's no way that actually happens. I'm like, I've seen talent shows stuff like them. But this kid's like, I'm going to do magic. But his magic was, behold, I'm going to change my voice just by snapping my fingers. So, like, he understands it's a joke, but he's not presenting it as such. Most of the room understood it was a joke, but some didn't. And my co-counselor that week, Natalie Bronson, and I don't know if either of you had met her, she stands up and screams, like hands in her hair, how did he do that? And the room loses it as he does this not magic. And it was this beautiful thing where he knew he was kidding. We knew he was kidding. He's announced the game. We were playing the game. And we were you know, I always liken the communion table to a drag show or to amateur wrestling. Like, we know there's an element of performance, but it doesn't make it bad. It actually helps, and when we all agree on the same game. So, yes.
I think that really goes to the point of, I guess what I'm trying to share is like, in the responsibility shift, right? Campers get to experience who get to test out who they want to be and who they are called to be. And it's our responsibility as counselors, if you're on that end, to encourage it, right? And to support and to love and to be like, how do they do that? Like, what a moment of kind of, the spirit at work could, or was that for that child who then felt like the support of, intergenerational support, which I think is a lot of what camp calls us to do and to be and to be present for, which is lovely. I'm noticing we have comments. Whitney, Catherine Wright is asking you to share a middle school gem experience, which I'm going to name while we're talking about other people. We will share experiences that we are being a part of or have been a part of. If it wasn't our story to share, we may not share them.
It's my story to share. It's
then
just embarrassing and gross.
Okay.
So,
We don't understand that, but
is it the off the stage, off the platform story?
Yeah. Sometimes camp is a place where you get to be your full self, and that's the self you chose to be. And sometimes that is the self that a stomach virus forced upon you. And so
you get to be your emptied self.
Your empty self, yeah. There's a process of self-emptying so that you can refill with Pedialyte and Phenegrin. I left and I didn't get to go to summer camp for several years when I was in seminary, just because I was doing different internship stuff, and that's what my summer was about. And so my first summer back, my 2 camp experiences, one was so rich, I got to keynote a camp that Arthur and were you directing that with Douglas Ann maybe? That they were co-directing.
Okay.
And no worries. I thought he was saying forgive me because he paid me with a Diet Coke. So that's real. But but my second camp experience that summer was co-directing Cairo camp with Will Ryan. Shout out Will Ryan, one of the greatest co-directors of all time, because we had a kid who brought a stomach virus to the entire camp. He was patient 0, and I was hanging out with him in the infirmary, in the nurses' station, thinking that he had dehydration sickness, and so trying to be sweet, trying to nurture my own motherly instinct. This was pre-Josie, obviously. This is 7 years ago now. So just sitting there patting his back, little hair tussle, you're gonna be okay, champ, it's all good. And then I finally get on the phone with Dad, and Dad's like, oh, he gets this wicked stomach virus every summer and then just gives it to everybody. And I was like, oh, cool,
awesome.
So yeah, that's how the story starts and pretty much ends of how my entire camp was infected with a stomach virus. And I got it first after we sent this poor kid home who was super sweet. And so yeah, it was crazy. I think we bought out Pedialyte in the Athens Walmart, and I'm very grateful to Lindsay Puckett, another shout out, for driving very quickly to get me to the emergency room. So yeah. So thanks, Catherine. Yeah, that's great. Time.
By the way, that wasn't the camp I was at. I missed the stomach.
Oh, I know. You weren't at that camp. I was just thanking you for paying me with a Diet Coke instead of a keynoter fee.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't even think about that. I wish you told me when I had some sort of power to write you a check. As somebody who just got stiffed on a wedding recently, that sucks. I apologize.
To be sure, I really love Diet Coke, so it was actually fine. And camp, so I'd do it for free, and I did.
Yeah, you did.
That's all right. Okay, let's go to. I have a question. Are we ready?
Yeah.
And these are so. As for those of you that follow us every week, thank you. But you all know that I write my questions down all week long. And this week I will name that there was so much. All my questions are so random and just they're not formulated and thought.
We've already invited Whitney to come back to discuss first day of camp and 10 years later.
So look forward to more.
So she's just got a trapper keeper full of appointments.
I have a trapper keeper full of appointments.
Okay, so my question was, as I rewatched this last night, as part of the talent show, right? The kids are singing Day by Day from Godspell.
Day by day.
Day by day.
I'm so old.
So is Godspell a musical written on the book of Matthew, of Christian text? Is it a call for interfaith work, or is it terrible evangelism on the part of Susie?
That's a really good question.
Because it's like, why do we think Showalter and Wayne put in this very specific song about Jesus into Jewish day school
to boo the cross?
That's also
well, no, I mean, and not like
because they boo at the end of
they boo at the end. They do.
They're all like grooving, and then the second it's. I thought it was a great gag.
No, I think it's a great gag. Well, I think it speaks. So the reason why I think the question is so perfect, Spiff, of like, is this really bad evangelism, or is it just like, the wider like joke and gotcha factor? I think that there are these pieces of culture that are so ubiquitous that they still end up finding themselves funneling into those spaces that are supposed to be safe for us, right? So like thinking about, we all said camp is a place where you get to be yourself, and you get to take some time out from the world as it expects, expects you to be, and find like who you truly are. And still there are those hiccups, like what Arthur said, of when it's good, it's good, when it's bad, it's bad. We all have bad experiences. I do think there's something to be said for being in the midst of like this huge community building moment where it is Jewish summer camp. And then someone's like, hey, have you heard the good news and gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ? And it's like, oh, thanks. But Godspell was such a like part of the ethos of life. Like that is such a camp song that it's like people go along with it, and then they're like, wait a second, no, boo. But I don't know. It's funny. It's funny to think about.
And it's a pretty non-religious song. I mean, it's vaguely religious, which works. It's not.
I mean, of all the songs in Godspell, that is probably the safest one to do.
All for the best.
Yeah.
I dream about you and I doing All for the Best sometime, Spiff, by the way. So just heads up.
I will
time is now. Let me hit play.
Some men are born to liberties, doing what they please, richer than the bees are in honey. Anyways, Godspell was the very first show I ever directed. In
That's
college.
True for like 80% of people. It's really
for sure.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. But it just struck me. I don't, as the tools that we use to talk about our faith, and especially the gifts of art and things like that. As I was watching this, the movie, and it's very based in Jewish culture, and I love that about it. And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, there's Godspell. Oh, right. Like, and it's a tool that we all use to talk about. I mean, the lyrics of that song are, like, oh, dear Lord, three things I pray: see thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly, right? Yeah. And so, like, those are all tools in which we talk about, like, our growing experiences in life. And yet I was like, oh, that's a sneaky little Jesus in there. and what a, sneaky little Jesus got in there. And I was just like, now as a Christian pastor, I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, I wish they would have done, I don't know what I would hope they would have done, but it's funny. I don't know.
Well, so let's talk about the comedy, if we could, for a second. Within it, I mean, comedy, they kill at least 2 children.
At least,
but also some are lovers, which is a beautiful.
Oh, that's right. There is.
Yeah. So it's a dark comedy at points, and also when you find out, oh, what's Gun Girl's name? You give her a piece of gum. Abby. You find out Abby was a camper in 10 years later.
You, Abby Burstein.
Yeah. That makes her making out with that 13-year-old kid who yells what meal it is better and also worse, and I'm not sure which. And so some dark humor is problematic because it's intentionally meant to cause dissonance. Molly Shannon marrying the 10-year-old.
Gail, is Gail funny and is Gail redeemable are 2 questions I have on my paper.
I'd like us to come to that. Maybe we can come into this with dark comedy. What do we do with narratives that are ultimately good, but have problematic aspects that are inseparable We could also talk about the whole, like, this is promised land that happens to have people who live in it that you have to destroy. Or everyone is made equal in the image of God, but women should be silent in churches.
Yeah, we could talk about all those things. No, just kidding. Next. No.
Fine. You are our guest.
No. I think that's worth lifting up and thinking about, and Arthur, I mean, you'll be able to speak to it much more than me, and Spiff, you too, I think, with your performance background and experience. But the idea of dark comedy isn't just that we're laughing at something that feels taboo or off limits. It's that we're trying to have a greater truth revealed to us that is so painful that comedy is perhaps the only like inroad in to allowing ourselves to sit with it long enough to actually think about it. And so I think about like Gail, and I think that the dark comedy piece of, so for those who are like, I don't know how, spoiler alerts 20 years later, I don't know, but
yeah, we've cut out, like we say all the time, we're full of spoilers. You're watching because you want to know.
And I think people will either watch this movie or not watch it, and it's not based on this. But yes.
You don't think we have that much power?
That's rude.
Okay, well, okay. But I was just gonna say, so Gail, like, has marital problems, is the art teacher at camp, like, is not teaching these kids how to do art, is really just like laying down all of her baggage on these children. Like,
it's Molly Shannon too, P.S.
Yeah, it's Molly Shannon, which is so over the top and hysterical, but also at some point you're like, this is a weird boundary crossing that even before we get to, the piece of her, like, leaving her husband, marrying a 10-year-old, which takes it over the top to a place of, like, we're able to laugh at the absurdity of it. But I think that the boundary crossing piece that it talks about is a very worthwhile consideration of how, like, adults put their stuff on kids and what we do when we create dynamics like that. And even thinking about, how that happens, I would say in ministry, I think some of the conversations that we have around, how are we cultivating community that is true and good? How are we, exercising power in ways that is healthy and life-giving and empowering of others versus exerting and exacting ourselves in situations where others are without power. Like, but I don't know that I would have sat with that theme if they just like laid that at my feet. So.
And is good ministry in part giving up yourself in order to be more present with others and have more room for them?
Yeah.
Imagine if the art teacher instead was saying, you probably have complex feelings. I've found that drawing helps. You can use crayons or markers because there's only one crayon left. It's the last day of camp.
Yeah. I mean, I think going back to like part of like what the complexity of dark humor, what it's the Second Kings where the bears maul the kids.
Yeah.
I mean, like there's that in our scriptures, right? I mean, so it's like, what do we do with these hard passages? What do we do with the parts of this movie that have not aged well, that use language that is incredibly offensive, as it does. Like, so if you do go to watch this, there are at least 2 times in my head that I can think of that are things that they use words that we just don't use
out of kindness and compassion.
Absolutely. And so both regarding sexual identity. And so what do we do? I think we have to name them. I think, some of my notes on here, like Whitney and I have just said that this is, our favorite movie, and yet it's so white, right? Like it's a super white movie.
Super white.
And that's super problematic, obviously. And while maybe it represented what was happening at the Jewish summer camps that David Wayne went to, who's to say, like, there's still a diversity issue that, we need to name, we need to address it. And that's, like, I think part of what this movie gifts us is that, this openness to talk, because of its absurdity, it allows you to say, well, here are the spaces that we need to hold it accountable, that we need to name as problematic, that maybe we didn't name as problematic in the very beginning because we were less knowledgeable then, less aware of certain things. And so, and in the same way with our Bible, right? The scriptures every week that we all preach on, like, we have to name the ways in which it's super problematic. We do not do a service, we do a disservice to our communities when we skip them, when we don't model how to wrestle well with challenging texts, with challenging characters and things like that. And so for me, that was a big part of rewatching this time, to say, like, I love this movie so deeply, but what can I name as part of my own privilege to say, like, this is not okay anymore.
So within that, I should note, I've been deep studying 1 Corinthians for the last few months, and that is going through 3 commentaries, pericope by pericope. Finally got to chapter 6, which includes the wonderful, idolaters, adulterers, malleable boys, and quote unquote homosexuals. But the two words that Paul used, anyways, I've always avoided that because I read at one point, my brilliant friend Chad said, these are paired, it's exploitative, don't exploit people. And it's a really good way to put it. Paul uses all of these idioms throughout his letter with the Corinthians. He throws back their phrases at them. So he may be doing the same with that terminology, which means it's even more contextual than we understood. Anyhow, I'm ready to preach on that list again, even though every time I bring it up, people probably expect me to say, well, we should just throw this up, but we can't. And we could easily edit all of the raunch and the inopportune stuff out of Wet Hot American Summer, but it'd be like 20 minutes long.
If that.
I
think you get a solid, like, 11 minutes. Like,
it would just be, we're going to town. Where's the phone? Skylab falling. That's it.
I'd watch that movie too. Well, I also think that there's a question too, and of, what it means for us to take the responsibility of problematizing things that we love, or things that have been a part of, like, our formation, and being able to point out and name for ourselves the pieces that are problematic, and then also looking for the communities that are appropriate to one, and venues that are, one, still appropriate to share them in, and two, the ways that, like, we have an education piece that's implicit for us, that's our responsibility. I think about that as a preacher, and thinking about, like, Paul's letters in 1 Corinthians, and if I'm taking those letters at face value in the ways that they were meant for that Corinthian community, specifically that Corinthian community, not, any of the other people that Paul wrote letters to, but that community, then I actually wouldn't get to stand up and talk about that letter, right? Like, that letter says, hey, for the sake of what's going on here, you lady need to zip it. But thinking about how that becomes a part of our heritage, our lineage as Christians, and if that is a letter that I'm going to speak to in the ways that it still has content and power for us, that is important for how we're understanding and living the gospel, then I have to be able to look at it and how it changes in my context, so that I can provide people an inroad and opportunity into hearing that. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Arthur, do you have more on that?
No, I want to talk about McKinley. Just period at some point.
Just McKinley and Ben, their chaise lounge. The throws that
Ben
Beth's sister
and
got
their
them.
chaise lounge.
It matches the throws that Beth's sister got them.
Well, and the joke, of course, is that they're accepting, which is so out of line for how they should act, which always troubled me until I was able to say, oh, the joke is that it's okay to celebrate gays. But I also just love how tender that scene is between Ben and McKinley.
I was watching again Hurricane of Fun last night, and they said, like, baby Bradley Cooper was just like, or no, I guess it was they were thinking about it, but they were talking about how that's the one scene in the entire movie that's, like, lit well and, like, has good camera angles, and Like it was like of this farce of a movie, it's the one like tender and true moment of the entire thing.
Okay, so on farce, if I may ask, and forgive me, Spiff, I should send you my questions in advance. I'm not trying to step on anything.
I like the spontaneity of what's about to happen. Also, there is fear.
This all feels about as sufficiently storyboarded as Wet Hot American Summer. So
perfect. Perfect. Okay, actually, I need to put a pin in this for 1 second. Can we talk about the fact that in the sequels, one, they only got Bradley Cooper to be in First Day of Camp because he happened to be flying to LA, because he was an Academy Award nominee, and he would be able to be there. And the last day of filming, they got him to do all of his scenes, and he was willing to do it. B, David Hyde Pierce in the first day of, or 10 years later, just shot it over Skype with his Emmys clearly behind him because he was directing a play, and ends it with, "Are we done here? Great." And okay, pin undone. With farce or spoof, we have the training montage. We have the nerdy kids build a device out of like cupcakes glued to a trash can.
Oh, the meet me over here in 10 seconds.
The meet me over here in 10 seconds. There's a bunch of really, I know it's part of the montage, but the flash dance with Christopher Maloney, which Gary is suddenly there and doing it. So it takes the tropes and it embraces the tropes, and it doesn't even challenge the tropes, but simply by doing them, it disarms the tropes, right?
Yeah. There's an earnestness.
Yeah. But they're also like, this is dumb as hell, so we're just going to use it. The satirical nature of Christianity, taking all of the empire language, taking virgin birth and Lord and anointed and all of this stuff, and just being like, yep, it's on our itinerant rabbi that y'all killed. He's Lord, born of a virgin, eternal to eternal, word of God right there, son of God. What do you got? What does it mean to break a narrative by using the narrative? I think of Steve Martin in The Jerk. I was born a poor black woman in Mississippi.
Well, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm playing with.
No, it's okay. I'm gonna tie this to another question that I had, because I think maybe that it'll help. Is that how does time work? So time as the like in Wet Hot, time very much is like you get like 1 minute and then like full days of stuff happens, and then it's like 8:04. If for those of you who haven't watched the movie, like it all takes place in 1 day. Yeah. And they give you a time narrative that runs through.
Which makes no sense whatsoever, yes.
Which, yeah, I mean, it gives you, I guess, the chronology of things, but like not necessarily like the actual like the trope of time, right? I guess is.
Okay, so it's narrative versus timeline.
Well, I think, narrative versus timeline, and then thinking about how that relates back to your question, Arthur, is the idea of like, who gets to actually control the constructs that we think we're operating within. And so, it's time as a construct, power as a construct, and then narrative as a construct even. Who are the ones who get to tell the story and get to choose the ways in which the story matters for different people. And so, to that piece of taking all of these parts of Greco-Roman culture that were significant in understanding, who would be the ones granted status and privilege, and what these extraordinary measures are that make one a god and worthy of worship, and worthy of power. And then to say, cool, so it turns out all of that applies to this person who you would have never picked or chosen to do any of these things. How committed are you still to the constructs of your narrative? And I think that that's the sort of like turning on its head that is required for us to break outside of the mold of our expectations of what life is supposed to be. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does for me. I think for me that's most it's all kind of tied together, but like I see that most in the after. So in the middle of the movie, the adult counselors go to town, and they go, huh?
To Waterville.
Waterville. And so
It's fun to go to town, even if it's far.
It's only for an hour.
So that's my right. Like they do things that clearly in the scope of real time would take more than an hour. They're not the most holy of things. It's like they're not the most kind, and they aren't the most self-serving. Well, I guess they're self-serving, but they're not the most community building of things. And like a bit debaucherous. And anyways, so there's a lot of drug use and stuff like that.
But also eating French fries.
And also eating French fries, but they also then mug a grandmother for no reason. They just like.
Well, and it's Jane Garofalo. It's not just the counselors; it's the director.
It's the director and counselors. But so my point on that trope that is that like, and who controls the narrative, right? Is they come back and someone says, "Hey, how was town?" And JJ says, "It's always great to get into town, even if it is only for an hour," right? They're like the understanding of what town is, like the break from which is required from your daily life, right? And like the reality of it is kind of in the trope of breaking the mold of narrative and who gets to control who is leading the dialogue around what things mean.
Well, I thought the most brilliant part of that, by the way, just want to note and brag on my husband. When they're pouring French fries into their mouths, he's like, those weren't around then. And I said, they're McDonald's French fries, and he didn't say more. Supersize didn't happen for another like 7 or 8 years, and he was able to recognize that they were the very large fries and just knew it on his timeline. I married a continuity expert. Number 2, as the person who would insist on making the town runs or just join on town runs, whether I had permission to or not, in part to engage in behavior that was not necessarily conducive at a summer camp. And
What was Arthur smoking, by the way?
Yeah, and because I used to smoke and I don't anymore, and I'm an idiot, sorry. I'm not apologizing to y'all. I'm apologizing to myself, to my kids as they make the memorial reel when I still die of COPD in like 20 years. But sorry, that was a little morbid. Can we cut that out of the Instagram? Whatever. Because of that, I thought that was one of the best parts of the movie of like, oh, I've done the town run. I've just jumped into people's cars. I have not been proven to have mugged any grandmothers.
Well, that's good. Going back to, we were talking earlier, our favorite lines. One of my very favorite moments in the entire movie is right after that when Coop says, "Oh, hey guys, wait up," and they're all just face first into the wall of the of like a barn. Yeah, and he's like, "Hey guys, wait up," and they all just go and they just stand there. Every time, it makes me laugh. Every time.
I just don't. It's just what they're doing.
It's just what there is no need. It is just like comic brilliance, in my opinion, where it's just like there is no need for it. It has nothing to do with the storyline. It comes out of nowhere, and it is so good.
I do think that it comes out of nowhere and it's so good, but I also, that's one of those moments of like, yeah, that's exactly what counseling summer camp is like.
For sure.
Like, you're like, hold on, let me get to a place where I can just like, for a moment, like lean into this wall.
Well, or here's something weird that we're doing with no explanation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, do your brown bag skate, you're fine. Which is my favorite camp activity, by the way.
Me too.
Brown bag skits.
Oh, brown bag skits. That's true. You did write that on our Instagram.
I love a good brown bag skit.
You know.
Yeah.
Amen.
So, okay, I think one of my last questions like kind of ties to this whole thing, and it may actually kind of just repeat, so we can also move on. But I'm just reading things, whatever. It says, there's a suspension of disbelief that is required for biblical interpretation and in this movie. If both exist in their best form beyond reality, what does that tell us about how we dream of the kingdom?
So Spiff wasn't.
Yeah.
Forgive me, Whitney. Go ahead.
Oh, go. No. Go.
It was in this. I think it was in a 2-on-1, and I cannot remember with whom because I can't remember with whom. But it was we're supposed to live into the world as we wish it would be, as we see it being possible, as opposed to the world as it is and trying to change it. If that, I know was that in a conversation we had with a guest, or is that, I've been reading
Maybe. I do know that Reverend Terry Hort Owens has been talking about that as well. If you've been watching, she talks about that a lot, about like naming, like we talk about justice and like the kingdom, but like have we actually named what the kingdom looks like?
well, and how I can totally act like I live in this world, or I do live in this world, and I can participate in this world in its fullness, but then I'm missing out on the kingdom that is developing, and I can also live in the kingdom that's developing. I'm just going to look like a madman. I wasn't sure about that, and Whitney, I'm sure you have something sage and brilliant.
I don't. No, I think no.
Not to put you on the spot. Sorry.
Cool.
Please win a Nobel Prize. Go.
I did it.
You did do it.
I just posted on Facebook that I did, so that means it happened. But I think that a little bit for me, this is coming back to that idea of constructs and like what that means for the kingdom, and a suspension of belief is in some ways for me like not exactly how, that's what you said, right? A suspension of belief.
It's a suspension of disbelief, but
okay, well, okay. So a suspension of disbelief, yes. So I'm glad that I have the clarification, because I think the thing that gets in our way so often of the kingdom and the world to come and what is possible is that we hold ourselves bound by the parameters that are currently in place versus what is 100% absolutely possible. You know, it's that abundance versus scarcity mentality of hearing people say, well, there's not enough to go around. And it's like, actually, there's exactly enough to go around. You just have to let it go around. And I think that that's the part that for me in this movie, with all the pieces that are problematic, the part of this movie that's beautiful for me is like, a day is enough time for all of this to happen. Like a day is enough time for them to save the world. You know, which like we haven't even really talked about like that meta part of the narrative that's totally ridiculous and asinine, but like a day is enough time for them to save the world, and then the next day happens and it starts all over again. Like, and so what if we were living into the beauty of like that being possibility instead of that being exhausting? Which is what I think that like the world puts on us more often than not, right? And so when I think about scripture, like, yes, you can look at the story of like, here's the story of God's people, like screwing it up again, way to go. Or you can look at it as, here's the story of God choosing to trust God's people again. Like, how powerful is that? And so for me, that perspective shift, I think, is important.
Well, which is a story that continues all the way through us and way past us as well. We're just one day of camp, so to speak. It is God who has the trapper keeper full of appointments.
It is full of appointments.
So many appointments.
And she will make it her beeswax to be at all of them.
Well, she's already changed her 10 o'clock twice. So.
It has somewhere to be at 11. Can we talk about, no, because that's not this one. We still have two more wet, hot.
Well, can we talk about the can of mixed vegetables? And the part of my question on, the suspension of disbelief equates, and I will name that at one point at the end. And so our last question is always part of like who, the biblical, and I will name one of the people. I kind of equated the can of mixed vegetables with the Holy Spirit. There's a little bit of move, especially with Jean, who we also have not talked about really. Yeah, there's so many good characters, friends. Like it's a movie full of really exceptional, rich characters. But Jean is Christopher Maloney. He is an ex-Vietnam vet. He is the chef. He has some personal experiences that he is going through regarding his own sexuality, and he talks to his PTSD, and it's talking to a can of mixed vegetables that talks back to him. and who offers some kind of sage wisdom in its own way of like, be you, right? Like essentially that's the call from the mixed vegetables is like, be you, show up as yourself, which I think is also equated to our gospel message, is just show up, continue to show up, and continue to show up as God created you. And that's really kind of what Jean is called to do. And so for me, in the suspension of disbelief and allowing room for the Spirit to work, is where I see most fully, or is how I saw that most fully was in the can of mixed vegetables, to be like, oh, like if he didn't listen to that, if that wasn't a part of it, then you don't actually get the fullness that is Jean. You don't actually get the richness that is Jean fondling his sweaters, or
fondue cheddar
with fondue cheddar, or the, you know, next to his packets of stick team stick ball, go away. So there's that. I don't know. That was where my suspension of disbelief actually like came in.
And there's clearly at some point in the writer's room, they said, what if he talks to a can of mixed vegetables? Or they saw the can of mixed vegetables and said, we have to give, like, there's...
How it was there.
As somebody who has done a whole lot more writing than performing, at some point, there's just these moments where you're like, this seems like a really good idea. And it either is or it isn't. The suspension of disbelief, that sticks out so much because it's both a really good and a really bad idea. Because, I don't know, I've loved it. I love Mitch. I love H. John Benjamin, who tried out for the role of Gary, I think? For Christopher Maloney's part.
Yeah, he's Jean.
Yeah, Jean. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I've done really bad sketch comedy before that we thought was hilarious because we definitely just kept frying that chicken.
right.
So.
Yeah, you commit.
You commit. You commit.
Why do we root for awful people? Because I think Andy is a terrible human, and yet I am in it for Andy.
Okay.
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not.
You're not, okay?
But Andy's the trope. Andy is
Paul Rudd.
He's a Greek god. He is literally cut from marble.
But just the end when Coop walks in his shining white shoes that Brian coveted. Brian being my husband, who had a completely different experience watching this movie, and I love it. As he walks in and Andy does the bully gets his comeuppance. But yeah, Andy sucks. Great character, just not.
Andy sucks, but okay. So well, then we'll bring. He's just awful. He making out. You taste like a burger. I don't like you anymore. Is such a. It
is a beautiful
genius. He's also the one responsible for like killing the kids most of the time.
That they didn't do it a third time, throwing a kid from the moving van, just makes me so mad because rule of three must be obeyed.
Which is even better that it makes you mad in that.
Yes.
But like, so then is Andy redeemable?
Andy can't be redeemed. The whole point of his story is he's irredeemable.
Then why does Katie end up with him? Are we supposed to hate Katie too?
I don't really like her. I don't hate Andy. I just like Andy serves a purpose, and that is to be the foil for Coop. And
so I think he serves a purpose to be the foil for Coop, but I also think so Andy is redeemable. That still doesn't mean I like him.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so if I, in the context of thinking about camp as a space for everyone to get to be and to exist and to be who they are, as it turns out, like, Andy's a jerk and he's the worst.
He has a Confederate flag in Maine in his bunk. Like, it's just,
there's so much about that characterization that is hysterical to go back and watch Paul Rudd do, because Paul Rudd is Paul Rudd, right? And so we're all like, oh my gosh, but I love Paul Rudd. And it's like, no, not this one. And yet he still gets to be there. And like, not only does he still get to be there, but there's also a sense of, he's the foil to Coop, but even for who Coop is never mean to Andy.
No, yeah.
Like, for the way that relationship is brokered and happens, it's just really fascinating of like, Andy's not getting kicked out of the kingdom either. And that's almost obnoxious.
Oh, that's scandalous.
Right. So, I don't know, but Beth did make him pick up his dishes.
One of the best physical comedy pieces just ever. Him picking up when the cup drops, like he's got it and then it drops again and it bounces and he gets it again. And then at the end when he takes his glasses and like pulls them out, puts them on.
And I'm sorry, do any of us eat mashed potatoes without like blinging the fork at least once after? Like, it's ingrained.
So,
This is an entire episode of us just laughing at our own jokes.
Not even our own jokes, just retelling
the
somebody
jokes
else's
that we do,
jokes.
exactly.
Oh gosh.
So I'll bring that back. I think Andy's redeemable. But I think it's interesting how much we hate Andy for lots of reasons. Like I think it's fine that we all hate Andy because he's awful, but we don't hate Gail as much generally. I mean, I would say
I don't mind Andy, and I cannot stand the Gail scenes. Like
I prefer the Andy scenes over the Gail scenes too.
The Gail joke. Oh, she's back in therapy, and there's a 9-year-old acting like a concerned, therapist with bad boundaries, and he's giving her a back rub. Okay.
And all the kids are in there like, Gail, it's okay. Like it's an entire group of like well-adjusted like 10-year-olds.
And I've seen small groups. I've not been in small groups, but I've seen small groups at camps where the adults Gail it up, and it drives me bananas. I'm not going to say more on that. I'm just going to purse my lips.
Sure. But we talk often about, just redemption. So I was like, oh, these are people that I very much hate. And
you get redeemed by giving up self.
Sure.
Why go to work at a summer camp? You're not going for the money. You're not going for the feeling clean or energized at all through the course of the week. You're going because it is to give yourself, and therefore there's room in yourself for whatever God is doing. Andy does not give of himself, Andy takes, and Gail does not give of herself, Gail takes. Everyone else arguably gives. Who's the best character in the movie?
What's our best character, meaning like the best person, best character, or our favorite?
Either. Both.
I think Coop's the best character in the movie.
Is he your favorite?
I would say from like a larger framework place, Coop's my favorite character, because I think that there are like lessons to be learned there that are valuable. For comedic value and what appeals to my comedic sensibility the most, it is Gary and McKinley, because they are the most understated for Gary and most absurd for McKinley. And those are things that I deeply value. But I think that Coop is, in terms of like a story arc and an understanding of like roundness in a character, I'd say Coop is the one that does it for me.
I do love the baseball team. Can we talk about the baseball game real fast, by the way?
Yes, because baseball just got announced that it's coming back today. So, or not today, but it got announced today.
Jamie Plunkett tweeted that there will probably be like 3 games before COVID gets irresponsibly bad and they have to cancel it.
Probably.
So, was it Jamie? I hope it was Jamie. Anyhow, the baseball game, Coop is doing the Bad News Bears routine, like just flat out. And again, it's the trope. And this time they didn't follow the trope through. The kids were like, we're just not interested. And he listened to the kids, and therefore they did not do it.
It all seems a bit trite.
Yeah.
It all seems a bit trite. You know what? You're right. There you go. I just, as the person who usually works on recreation and energizers at camps, like we've done games where nobody wants to be playing it, nobody wants to be leading it. We would have done better to just sit on the field and talk for an hour and a half.
Well, I was gonna say, as the person who always has to lobby for the indoor kids,
Well,
with, like in those spaces, you know, it's like.
Well, and I
Yeah.
will note, my favorite activity in all of camp ever was when we did the Olympics the first time at CYLS, because there were indoor kid games.
Yeah.
There was the baby puzzle challenge where we took 3 20-piece puzzles, mixed them up, and we're like, you're a princess, you're Mario, you're Paw Patrol, go. And just dumped the pieces out, and they had to, you know, like, no athletic skill. One game was called Dice Chuckin', where you chucked dice and whoever got the highest number won.
Sounds great.
I don't see a problem with it. As I'm gonna keep us moving just a little bit. No, I think that I love that. Yeah.
My favorite is McKinley.
Your favorite is McKinley?
Or Gary, because Gary takes a lot of abuse and is just like, yeah, I'm not scared of you. And also he does the flash dance scene.
That's true. I think my favorite is Gene.
Yeah.
I laugh. It just makes me laugh. But I don't know, they all do. I think you're right. Coop is the best, like as a human, like he's the best person, I think, out of all of them. I think Beth has a good heart in there, but I think Coop is actually doing the work to like be a good person.
Yeah.
Really forgives Katie when she's late for school, and I appreciate that. And so, but Gene will always have a piece of my heart. I love him. As we all know, I'm a big Christopher Meloni fan. So, anyways, but I know that our time together today is coming to a close. So we have a final question here on 2-on-1. The only question that is ever told to you ahead of time.
Boom, 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 boom.
We really do need a theme song. Anyone out there, get us the theme song. So what biblical stories or characters do you see kind of present in these characters from Wet Hot?
Yeah. So the two biblical stories that jumped out to me the most were one, the story of like that Saul to Paul conversion, because I feel like that happens both with Gene and with Coop, of this sense of like some pivotal moment happens in their life where like, kind of what you were saying about like the intervention of the Holy Spirit with canned vegetables. But there's a pivotal moment that happens and suddenly who they are is categorically changed. And what that means for like the way that they'll live life moving forward. I think that that's really valuable and good for thinking like about that framework. And then the other story that came to mind for me, which we have not covered a whole lot of talking about, we briefly mentioned Abby in passing, who is kind of like the camp hottie who is, just somebody that everybody wants to make out with. They would like to take a stick of gum from her.
Because
she does make out with everybody. It's not just a want, it's a...
Yeah, she does. She makes out with everybody. And so thinking about though, like all of the immediate dispersions that are placed upon Abby and assumptions that are inherent there, and then thinking about the primary male that gets juxtaposed to her is Victor, who has his little sidekick Neil. And Victor is like going to do whatever he needs to do to be able to make out with Abby Bernstein. And that story very much reminds me of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. And like the idea of how so much gets heaped on top of Bathsheba in the ways that we retell that story. But when you go back and look at like the greater picture, she is the one who's very like much not really like being acted upon in the scenario in some ways. And then also just like Victor totally leaving Neil high and dry in that canoe or in that kayak with those kids as they're whitewater rafting. I very much feel that is David like, hey, Uriah, we need you on the front lines. Gotta go, boy! So that was, those were my two main biblical story reflections.
I love it. Yeah.
What about you?
It's Balaam's ass.
Oh, that came up for me too when we were talking about canned vegetables.
It's Numbers 23. It is. We looked at this in Bible study a few months. Time is unnecessary. But it's meant to be a comedy. It's supposed to be a story where people are laughing.
Yeah.
Because the donkey talks, and nobody is like, oh, a talking donkey. Like, the story has become so unwieldingly ridiculous that there's all of these great moments where, and of course too, this is a dark comedy, but it is a comedy. And in comedies, there is a happy ending. And with Balaam, he gets fired because he keeps prophesying in favor of God's people. And the first time when the king, whatever his butt, goes and says, what are you doing? He says, or the king says, you have done nothing but bless these folk. And I think that's really the point of comedy, even if it's a hard truth to hear.
I like that.
Yeah. I mean, I have a little kind of, I had there's a Samson and Delilah thing happening with Andy and Katie. I had the can as the kind of like a movement of the Holy Spirit. But the more I think about it, as we've been talking about it, I think, so one of my favorite lines is Katie and Beth sitting and says, when they're talking about her date, when they're talking about Beth's date, and Katie suggests moose, and Beth goes, moose, like moo, moo. And I think it's just a really sweet moment between the two of them. And I think that there's an Esther Vashti thing happening there, but you expect Beth to be Vashti in that moment, right? Just out of age and kind of like the structure of camping systems. But I think it's actually reversed, in which Katie's been trotted out her entire life as like, she's the hot one. Katie, you're hot, right? And is this the question posed to Katie? And then she teaches Beth kind of like how to live into her own self, but also like do what is necessary, right? Like act within the system, but like do so of your own integrity. And I think that that's got a Vashti feel to it for me. The Vashti Esther kind of dropped out, but
I wouldn't have seen that. I like that. I'm glad you shared that.
So that, I mean, the other ones I'm not as like keen into all of them. Like I said, I had a really hard time pinning this down, but those two for me, like that feels right. Gene's got a little John the Baptist kind of ness happening with the wildness of spirit that and like look. I have Gail as David just because she's a rapist.
Real.
Sorry, I mean, I don't know what else. Like that's the story, and we need to hold these stories faithfully, right? Okay. I mean, like this accountable, and that's what happens with Gail. That's what happens in the story of David. And so, I also had Susie's ambition as Jael, and like she spikes like anybody in her path that is not allowing her to really kind of her and her people, which are the acting troupe, to flourish. She has that like Jael energy, I think.
That's a story I want to tell y'all. Is this Cleveland Community Theater?
Yeah. Is this the Cleveland Playhouse? Is it Cleveland Playhouse or something like that? Yeah.
There was a camper, and I hope he is well, and his name starts with G, and some people will remember him because he graduated a few years ago. Anyhow, very principled in terms of a brown bag skit, where at one point in the 7th grade, he goes, "What is this? Is this some sort of camp production? We need to do this correctly." And
that's the level of movement I like to see out of a brown bag skit.
Yeah. Right. And everyone else was like, "Shut up." But hey, he was living.
But I'm like, give me more.
This has been 2-on-1 rather. Whitney, thank you very, very much for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
For first day of camp and for 10 years later of the.
Can't wait.
Go for the trifecta.
I
next week.
My beeswax to be there.
Oh, good. Yeah. Trapper keeper full of appointments. Next week we will be off. Spiff is on vacation and I am on vacation, and we are going to respect the fact that we're vacationing, not together, not yet. So we're going to take at least 1 week off. We might make it an actual summer break of 2 weeks, but we haven't talked about that yet. It's a surprise. It probably will be back.
So many surprises.
But But we'll definitely see you again on 2-on-1. Thank you again, Whitney. And thank you to our wonderful June guests, all of you as well. And until next time, bye.
I wish we had an outro. I wish we had some good outro music.
I just hope somebody will do a recording of "It's the Final Question." All right.
I feel like that has a Travis Smith Wiki vibe to it. Travis, get on it.
All right. We are off on Facebook, and we